Okay, so I'm working on the plot to like a story and I'm trying to get it out there. And the basic idea is that it starts off around in the 1950s and it starts off with a regular character named Forrest. And it starts off when he's about 18 and he's living at home and everything like that. And, like at the start of the story, he like lives in a small town and he goes to school and everything like that. And, he has struggles like, people typically would around that time period. And, as the story goes on, there's character development and everything like that. And, it gets to a point where it's like everything's happening around the time period of the 1950s. And after a certain point, it's like there's a blackout. And, the reader doesn't know what's going on. And, the main characters are kind of like scattered, throughout the plot and everything like that. And then, it jumps ahead 30 years later. The main character's Forrest is, um, Forrest turns out to have schizophrenia. And, before they got to where they are now in the story, before Forrest was in Cicero, Illinois, pre-blackout, and that's where he was living with his family and everything like that. And post-blackout, constructed he has constructed like a medieval steampunk kingdom, of his own design pretty much, and the story goes from him being a regular character to him growing into like a flawed king or leader, and it's like he's got to make morally great choices that, corrupt his spirit, as the plot goes on pretty much. And he has a love interest, and, her name is Echo, and she is the queen of the kingdom while he is the king. And they have an inner circle of people that they, have trust, and there's about like 8 people in the main group of the story pretty much. And they all have their own like unique abilities and skills and everything like that. And, they think they're the only civilization or whatever left. And, they think that the blackout wiped out much of humanity pretty much. But as they go out and explore like the rest of the world and everything like that and see what's, outside of their, small portion of secure land that they have or whatever, they find out that there's, enemies living in their backyard or whatever. And, that to some capability, they're stronger than the main characters pretty much. And the enemies in this story, they represent everything that, Forrest and his group is essentially, standing for. Forrest and his group kind of stand for humanity and, progress despite survival and destruction and everything like that. And, the enemies, they stand for like, everything chaotic about the apocalyptic world that they're living in now. And Forrest's arch nemesis in this world is a man named Ignatius. And he kind of controls like, San Francisco, which is like now this technocratic cult type of place, on the West Coast or whatever. And, at some point there was like a technological boom before the blackout. And in this timeline or whatever, it allowed them to have like stuff like iPhones and advanced computers and stuff like that at a way earlier time than we have access to. And but for the most part, they're restricted to like they're restricted to like 1950s tech, 1950s weaponry, 1950s cars, 1950s, you know, everything, except it's 30 years in the future. So, yeah. And, so later on, it's like, Ignatius has a love interest too, and her name is Marissa. And Marissa she guides, like, she is like the warden of Alcatraz at San Francisco, pretty much. So she has some power or whatever. And, as the story goes on, Forrest and Ignatius fight or whatever. And, each time they do, it reveals more about Forrest, and it reveals how they both lead their groups pretty much. And, Forrest's ultimate goal is to orchestrate this man's death, in the trilogy. And, so it's at that point, and he has a daughter named Alice, and with Echo, Forrest does. And Forrest needs to prepare Alice for the next phase of the kingdom or whatever. And he has to like raise her and protect her and everything like that. And at some point in the story, Forrest starts seeing her in a darker light, and whatever that be, whatever it's due to time or whatever, it causes him to be a more, morally gray person. And he's easier to cross the line. He's more comfortable with murder and everything like that, and he doesn't really think about what he does. And, and he does want to achieve this goal of like killing Ignatius, and as the trilogy goes on, he's got to consider in his head, if he could manipulate Alice into killing Ignatius.